Here we go. Computer's got a case of the Mondays as well. So as was mentioned, my name's Mike Eshu, and I'm a technical delivery manager and own customer onboarding and adoption for AWS managed services. And you can see a few things about me that our marketing team have put together. Ajit?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ajit. Thanks for joining today. As part of AWS Professional Services team, I lead global DevOps practices. I travel across the world, meet with enterprises, and help them adopt and implement DevOps at large scale. And that's for their long-term success to drive agility, innovation, and operational excellence. As you can see on slide, someone decided to throw in a little fun on Monday morning. I did not know that I liked ITIL as much to show up on the slide, so we'll deal with it afterwards. So
I think we can both agree we don't love marketing webinars.
For sure. Cool. So we put up a great agenda for all of us today. What we have, for those of you who did not have a chance to attend our last webinar around enterprise DevOps, we'll provide a quick recap on what enterprise DevOps are, and then we'll get into our main topic for today, that is patterns of efficiency. We'll talk about how one of our customers has been able to make wins implementing enterprise DevOps, and then we'll cover how to get started on your journey. We'll also take questions from you, and we'll try to answer as many as time permitting before we leave. And if you could not get to your questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. We will have contact information towards that. So let's get into our agenda for today, starting with what is enterprise DevOps. If you have been observing space, and if you are aware of what's happening in the industry, we talked about in great details in our last session, but enterprises are really needing a lot of speed and agility. They are needing it for getting ahead of the competition. They are getting, and some are doing it for their survival. Some are doing it so they can be relevant in business, and some are doing it so they can differentiate what they bring on the table. DevOps is a mindset, is a working model that provides speed and agility and helps them lower their risk and cost while increasing the quality. While everyone is interested in doing DevOps, what we are seeing when I talk around and go around to customers, only 13% of them, this came out of a survey from Forrester last year, that only 13% of enterprises have fully implemented DevOps. Many of them are in the journey. Some have started it, some are thinking about starting it, but talking about how many have really understood and really taken it to the end-to-end, we are looking at still large we still see a large gap. So getting into the further details, Mike, if you can.
Yeah, sure. And I think one of the things we talk about, and I'm certainly, you probably see more than I, but the DevOps blockers in the enterprise, right? And I think what I'm observing, and I spend a lot of time when I enter a conversation with the customer, typically with their central IT teams or their corporate IT teams. And what I see quite often is, you'll hear complaints from application teams saying, oh, well, our governance and compliance team wouldn't allow us to really adopt DevOps, or, we'd be challenged to, bring our security team on board with a, CI/CD pipeline, full continuous integration, continuous delivery. And then, I'll often ask pretty simple questions like, well, have you sat down and explained what DevOps means and how you could imagine that function, be it compliance or security or governance, implemented within a DevOps set of processes and values? And so just sit down with the compliance person and explain what's possible. And that's what we're going to spend some time talking about today as we get into the patterns of efficiency, is how you can have some of those conversations with teams that might not be studying the latest trends of DevOps or studying, interesting ways of automating detective controls. So, one of the things we're starting to realize, and when we talk about enterprise DevOps, how we start to think of defining it is are there these two states of mind, right? If you don't have these conversations, of course, you do have this group of people who we just happen to label on the slide as traditional IT, but they could be organized anywhere within the large organization, wherever you're keeping your risk team or your governance team, your security team, and so on. You've got that set of folks that have important value to deliver to the business. And then on the other hand, we have our application teams who are excited about new technologies being released. They want to go fast. They know how to automate things. They have the skills already. They understand the values of iteration to achieve the outcome of business innovation. They partnered deeply with their business teams, but perhaps we haven't found that equilibrium between these two parties. So then we start to get in this debate of ITIL, which sometimes frames those process folks there on the right hand side of the slide, and then the DevOps folks on the left hand to the side, and then what you start to see is these DevOps teams, are starting to do things that may perhaps not be compliant. Everyone has access to everything. If we're in a compliant environment for, say, PCI, that would be a violation of the PCI audit control. And then, releases are just going out with zero review. And so the folks on the right hand of the slide are looking at the folks on the left hand side of the slide and say, well, that will never work. And then vice versa, we look and we say, 100% of approvals go through a cab. And these other reasons why these legacy IT processes aren't keeping up with the speed of the business. There's 40 people on that review board. By the way, in ITIL, there's nowhere in ITIL that actually says, you have to have 40 people approving change requests. That's something, a company may implement that might not be aligned with business agility. And so you start to see these conflicts between the DevOps teams and the ITIL teams because they're not taking that time to understand one another's perspective and understanding what technology can do for them. So our concept is enterprise DevOps. Let's take the best of the DevOps world and let's take the best of the ITIL world, and through sharing of both skills and knowledge, find ways of enabling those and now enterprise DevOps teams. So one of the things I'll use a lot with customers is this concept of the operating diagram. And just to orient you to how these diagrams can be used for your business, I'll start on the left-hand side of the slide, the traditional IT slide. And so here's a 4-square operating model diagram where we vertically divide, design from operations. So that could also be engineering or system integration of commercial off-the-shelf products. And then horizontally, I divide the application layer from the operational layer. And so in this 4-square model, we can imagine filling in the different teams. So in the bottom right, you have the infrastructure operator. The top right, you have the application operator. Top left was probably that system integrator that helped with procurement, delivery, and integration of that application. And then, of course, cloud engineering was able to provide, a recommendation on infrastructure against the application spec. So a very traditional IT operating model. Then we go to the other side, you just take one team and they do all the things. They're going to do all aspects of the IT operational ecosystem. They're going to design, they're going to operate what they build. Now, the challenges in the large enterprise is quite often networking or access to corporate resources gated by networking teams. And then there's compliance teams and security teams and governance teams, maybe a DDoS team. Or folks looking out for the security posture of the internet-facing web applications delivering value to end customers, perhaps. And so that's where we look at this middle model of enterprise DevOps, where the cloud engineering team or corporate IT is able to look after that layer of value that they have expertise in and can be shared against the enterprise at large. We don't need to hire a networking engineer for every single DevOps team. Rather, we have a group of network engineers that are able to deliver self-service consumable networking connectivity to the DevOps teams, right? So we're just taking that bottom layer out. And so hopefully these visuals you could use them and model your own organization, both where you are today and where you might like to go. So let's click into what that looks like as you engage with those different personas outside of the application development team.
Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned is very important for enterprises, especially in large-scale DevOps adoption, is how do we look at our teams? And when we start doing a DevOps, a lot of time it's talked as a technology and development team and QA, and it's centered around the core application DevOps area. But also, let's understand the crux of the well-operating enterprises is what resides in between, and at the crux of it is the collaboration, communication, where everyone is able to bring in what they do the best and what differentiates them. So these organizations have been able to leverage SMEs for the parts of the business, and they partner with them. They educate each other. They build a stronger community of subject matter expertise, and they keep on increasing their skill set. As we go further, we look at this is a pretty ideal cloud adoption curve, which in all practicality we see that there is a deviation from it. There are these typical adoption starts as a project, then you build a foundation, then a migration and cloud native approach starts, and we start to do renovations. What happens is, as you go further maturing into, there are many stakeholders, and they are a very important part of the journey. The importance and the subject matter expertise of success comes from different functions and different departments that make up the enterprise. And many struggles to scale their DevOps when the non-IT functions come into picture and run into danger of falling off the cliff or even stalling. As you see here, it's easier to start with the development and testing and a little bit of operations. Even security, as we are seeing a trend that it's getting built in a little bit sooner. But the other important functions, they really struggle. And when that happens, we also see that the great stall, which actually hampers all the progress that you made, and you feel that you're stuck in there, and people think that DevOps is not working, or enterprises are going backwards and they're trying to figure out how do we become even more nimble and agile. So we'll start today. In order to get into the stall, there are 4 important patterns to come out of that stall and continuously improve your efficiency. These are security, finance, governance, and compliance. We'll dig each of these deeper and understand what are the patterns among each of these that make you successful and efficient when you're thinking about enterprise scale DevOps adoption. So we'll start with security.
Sure, and I admit, talking about security at AWS, first I'd like to point out there's so much content, both from our conferences and our technical summits. There's so much content that you can go out and consume on security. I'm just going to throw out a few ideas today that only scratch the surface of different ways of thinking about security today, both the cultural aspects of it and then the technical aspects of it. So I guess the disclaimer I want to make is, there's fantastic content out there. And I want to tease some of that with some ideas I'm going to throw at you today. But to really implement a lot of these is going to take additional study and experimentation. And of course, deep partnership with your security teams, regardless of how they're working today. So I think so much of getting to these patterns of efficiency is really assessing where you are today. Take the time to do that assessment and then strategize which pattern is going to give you the most value and how you're going to work yourself into that pattern. But the first pattern related to security is automate aspects of security. And I caveat that word aspects because some parts of security still require people. There's still a fair amount of judgment that goes into making applications and IT ecosystems, IT services secure. As many know, the only true way to effectively secure a system would be to cut a cord. And it's not the network cord, it's the power cord, right? So if we didn't have IT services, then we wouldn't have IT security problems, but we also wouldn't be able to create business value. So you need to have that conversation with your security teams, right? Remember, the security professional are experts in finding ultimately business risks. And perhaps your security professionals teams haven't thought about automated ways of finding those risks. So we need to, shift to include automated security detective controls and then automated responses to those controls. Changing ways of working means changing means of control. So in the past, when we could go through rigorous security reviews before the annual software release cycle, which would get released to manufacturing, and CD-ROMs would be produced and put into boxes and shipped all over the world, we could have this really rigorous security review cycle where all sorts of testing could occur and so on. Cloud technologies and the modern state of application development through DevOps processes allow for high rates of innovation, which allow the business to quickly respond to changing business conditions. And that means we're doing many more shorter releases. So security teams can't do a 4-week security review followed by a 4-week penetration test after each cycle of innovation. And so there's many things that are better automated. All of those checks that we can convince the security professional to write down and then we can codify, we can then be checking those things continuously. And we can be ticketing teams with violations continuously, and we can focus on the defects that we identify. And so, of course, now there's more layers of security engagement. And if you think about how application teams want to consume their different layers of engagement, is they want it to be built into their pipeline. They just need to know and go through an automated gate or a big manual stop sign as they go through their code deployment process. And so how does pen testing, for example, fit in DevOps? I'd like to think it's something we don't do as it relates to a big point-in-time release, but something we're thinking about doing continuously. Or we're teaching our application teams to be triggered by, hey, I'm doing something that's non-standard. I'm innovating in a way that I haven't done before. I'm concerned about my risk posture. I'd love to consult with the security team, get some recommendations. That could quite likely be a penetration test. But we're now needing security to assume these 4 different ways of working, from AppSec to OPSEC to penetration testing to consultation, to be able to best prescribe how to enable the DevOps team to go fast.
So in your observation, among these type of testing, which one has been the most difficult for you personally to incorporate within your DevOps?
Yeah, I always think, penetration testing is hard, right? There's a high degree of burden to bring in an outside team, train them on what you're doing, give them the access they need to put on a thoughtful penetration test. And so it often feels like we're going into a big time sink. But what I would say, as challenging as that's been, I think the penetration test findings are almost always the most valuable. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think the most important thing I'd suggest, right, is at AWS, certainly security is priority 0, right? And that penetrates every aspect of the organization. We think about it regularly. Our leaders talk to us about it regularly. And I think when you're creating this breadth of offers and you're really investing in engaging from a security perspective with your DevOps teams and thinking about these different ways of training, OPSEC and AppSec and penetration test and general consulting on how to build security into your applications. You'll certainly hear themes of DevSecOps. How we build that in our DevOps teams are critical. And it also goes a long way of making security part of that application development process so they can feel like they're adding the value of which they have expertise to do, while also enabling the business. And when security is closer to the business, we believe the business is better for it. And then, example of security team offerings. I'd encourage you to work with your security teams to document their different offerings. What does an AppSec package mean, and how is an application team going to consume it? How could they consume those continuous checks that the application team may be building? Or maybe the security team can take requirements from the application team to understand how security can build those automated checks into dev team pipelines that several dev teams could consume at scale. Onboarding to operations, create easy escalation mechanisms. Make it easy for customers to escalate and get help from security anytime they're concerned. And make sure it's not at fault. So if somebody thinks there's a security issue, we don't want to go and punish or make fun of that person if it turns out to be a non-event. Create that culture of escalation that's positive. And then certainly senior leaders, business leaders need to be participating in security reviews. Business leaders need to be brought along in the process so that they realize, if security is holding back a dev team, they shouldn't be mad at the dev team. They need to bring security and development with them, or we're going to, continue to have security issues, which will have dramatic impact to the business. The cost of the impact far higher than investing in prevention. So we've got security down, and let's take a look at our finance friends.
That's my favorite. Right? Yeah. Someone told me there is nothing greener than the money, and
That's pretty good.
cool. So when it comes to finance, in most of the times when I come across technology teams, and this happened to me even in my previous career where I was managing a larger technology teams, where we would not pay as much attention to what we are using and how we are using, and sooner or later you realize that it's always important for someone, mostly in finance, that what is the cost of doing business. A common thing is scale up, scale down, or throw more hardware to solve the problem. And we have seen that repeatedly everywhere. Now, you may be throwing all that to serve to bots for that matter. Do you have that visibility? And maybe serving to bots is beneficial for your business, but what's the cost of doing it? So we must all the time know the cost of doing the business. And then, uh, in another example, you may be throwing most expensive VMs and highest possible I/O provision for your VMs to process the data in minutes, only to realize that you were doing all that to seize an opportunity worth 100,000, but you ended up spending all that into just getting a lot more hardware. So doing cost of business, knowing cost of doing the business is super critical and super important. But then, do we have insights that show where are the tight corners, or do we have to have fight between the departments to even have a clear visibility into what does consist in making the cost of doing business? So, and ultimately, everyone wants to know: are we healthy? Not just technology-wise. Is my application running? Are my customers getting what they are looking for? But also business-wise, are we viable? Are we healthy? That's also important. So that's the important part of knowing when it comes to finances. But those are also important to build into what we do and how we do. So the thing that comes around finance is the accuracy and visibility. It is up to us on technology side is how do we architect visibility into our product? How do we modularize them? One of the ways that you can do that is by tagging when you're operating in AWS. But how do you do for the common tier of applications and architecture? That way everyone is very clear on what's going on. The second thing is by providing visibility. And do you have an eye on, are you really saving or optimizing where you can? Remember, a dollar saved is a dollar earned. Actually, it's more when it comes to earning when you save it. But it's important that we focus on building those. The third, actually, it's anti-pattern. I call them sci-fi toys of hypnotism. And that's mainly because we have seen repeatedly, while innovation is important and we want to have focus on a quick experimentation, sometimes we see teams get indulged into a long battle of creating innovative things without knowing critically that does it help their business or not. It may be a cool demo, it might be a cool project to work on, but what's the cost of doing it? While creativity is important, again, importance for finance team is to keep the business viable and keep going. So again, the word of caution there is let's not get ourselves hypnotized. Let's remember and that there is someone who cares about the cost of doing business. And if those concerns can be ours, we not only will be architecting well, we will have an eye on operational excellence from day one, and our job is to build that in. The one of the another continuing on pattern around finances, we don't necessarily include finances other than when we need resources or we need budgetary approvals. But in enterprise space where everyone brings in a lot more talent than what we think, a finance function is existing in an enterprise because they bring in some core values. They make business viable, and by including them into your planning, into your architecture, into everything you're doing, you might be able to unlock additional opportunity or another aspect that you were not thinking earlier. So at the same time, by having them in your part of your teams and in your architecture, what you can do is you can get an early input on what are the things that make their lives easier, how do we involve them in major technology decisions, and share expense trending that, or even the budget trending. You can do all of that by including them early enough and also making them your friends. Now, in most cases, I led a pretty large cloud migration, and when it comes to earning autonomy and really making them friends, it comes by earning controls. No one gives you control, you have to earn it. And that comes with doing the right things. And with the DevOps mindset, by inclusiveness, by providing visibility, you can really you can start to win their confidence. You can have the checks and balances. I still remember back in the days when I was creating my first AWS environment, someone had to click and buy VMs for me. And over years, no one actually was asking me, and I ended up the one who was provisioning and buying those VMs in a more automated fashion as we needed, because we built our guardrails around what was our budget, what was approval, what were expense trends and tracking. So those you earn as you do and provide more visibility. That's not to say that you don't have the governance framework around it, but if you include those and employ the controls, then you are better off, and uh, everyone is basically focusing on doing the real things versus chasing. Did you just exceed the budget, or you're under budget, or what are the opportunities? I think by including and making them our friends, by we becoming their eyes and ears on the ground, so they can focus on constantly making sure that the business is still viable, we add a lot more value by including them.
Yeah, I kind of wonder, Ajit, when you didn't have the permission to pick the instance, or you make your own buys. Did you ever have situations where you may have tried, you'd been running for a little bit and you wanted to experiment with using a cheaper instance size, and you weren't able to make that change because you didn't have permission?
I actually have had good and bad both experiences. The good one was uh, I I was thinking that I probably need 100 instances, and I went ahead and if the keys of the kingdom were left to me, I would have gone and bought all those 100 at once. But I had a sane finance friend, and he kept saying that, okay, how about we start 10, and you show me that those are all utilized, then I will make sure that I'm available 24 by 7, and under 5 seconds I'll buy it for you. And that really worked out well, not only from the perspective of me learning and going through how the functions work in finance. The person also explained me that it's different in cloud. Earlier you were buying upfront, so there was no reason to worry about, the investment was already made. In cloud you pay as you go, and there was an opportunity for us to optimize. So we started buying that, and honestly we were able to save like 15 grand by doing that a step of progress. On the flip side, uh, I was managing on an incident, and we thought we could probably throw in and solve the problem by throwing a little bit hardware at it, resources at it, and we could not, because the person wasn't available for us to buy it. So there are good and bad. Uh, what came out of that was we still had a little bit of room, but we did not open the kingdoms of the keys of the kingdom
Sure,
to
just
everyone.
building those rules of trust from one, from
Exactly.
one team member to the next. What can we sort of processify or automate versus where do we still want to have those interactions where we can be sharing our expertise?
Right, and that's a good segue into continuous compliance, because you have to be constantly in compliant with what you're doing, and is it compliant with organization policies and practices? Include finance is just part of it, but there may be others. So why don't you? I'll hand it over to you for talking about continuous compliance.
Sure thing, yeah, and I think hopefully folks are enjoying the pattern of patterns that we have going here, right? It's really about engaging with those stakeholder groups who have the expertise that the application dev team might not, and looking for better and more efficient ways of working. So compliance is perhaps my favorite, not unlike security. I think you're going to see a lot of similarities between compliance and security. The ways of thinking are similar. And so first you have to start with, like, what do you want to be compliant to? And, in every one of your different businesses, I'm sure there's different compliance drivers that are impacting what you do. Whether you work in the financial services industry, the healthcare industry, oil and gas, mining, and so on, everyone is going to have, be regulated differently or not at all. And you're going to have to consider compliance differently for your business. What we're going to kind of focus on today is businesses where compliance has an opportunity to be automated, or compliance checks could be automated. That starts to shift the role of the compliance team. And I think sometimes that can be intimidating to the compliance team, who are quite comfortable operating and acting as they do with the expertise that they have, and they're somewhat hesitant to change, realizing they can move from, sort of compliance where the information's all packed in their head or the manual's on their desk, to actually getting to be part of that application development team, codifying what they know. So another challenge that goes along with this is that compliance and control, I think, is changing at a pace faster than it ever has before. And so another thing to help work with your compliance team to help them realize the need to evolve is that there's just more to be compliant with. I think GDPR is a great example. If we look at how quickly that legislation took hold and how deeply it impacted IT companies across the globe, and how they had to evolve their compliance posture to be compliant with the GDPR-based directives, right? And so because of this velocity of change, teams need to think differently about both how they attestate or certify a given application as compliant. How do they make sure it stays compliant into the future? So I like to use the term continuous compliance for that. So what that means is the compliance pro now needs to mechanize compliance. They need to tell teams when they're non-compliant systematically, and they need to be able to easily provide guidance to teams on how to fix it. And what I'm not imagining here is, say Carol from the compliance team coming down and calling on that application development team. No, rather systematically notifying those teams of non-compliant issues with guidance or pointers to run books to go fix those issues. And if that can't be used, a very easy way to engage the compliance department. And so, a story I think about when I think about mechanizing compliance, I remember working with a customer in the United Kingdom, and I just happened to be sitting next to the representative of the compliance department. And she turned to me, and the cloud migration, the cloud transformation she was going through was clearly a bit nervous. This was one of the first meetings she'd been brought to sort of learn about the cloud journey the company had decided to go on. And she was, very much, had worked for the company for a long time, and very much concerned about the risks that moving to cloud could pose the company, and how her processes would have to evolve. And she was fearful she'd not be able to add, and her focus was specifically on business continuity, and very much worried that some of these critical systems the company was running wouldn't be able to meet their requirements to their regulators. And I had a chance just, over coffee at a break to talk through, hey, what are the checks you check on? Oh, well, I go into the asset ledgers and I assure we have a DR site in another location. And when I see the asset record of the server that's attached to a given business application in both of the sites, I know that they're meeting the requirement for having redundant hardware. Well, I thought, oh dear. Well, do you know if those servers are running? Are they performant? Are they returning web pages when requested? And she's like, well, I don't really know those things. I'm not really, that's not really for, I don't have an easy way of figuring that out. And so it's easier for me to just look at the asset records. I was like, oh, what a great opportunity for a cloud check that could go, and she could have the development teams build her a dashboard that are systematically polling the DR readiness of a given business application. And she's like, oh, so I would always know. I'd continuously know that we were compliant. Yes, that's continuous compliance. And so, the example of how you can do this, of course, AWS has config rules. The example here is ensure all attached EBS volumes are encrypted, a PCI requirement. All data is encrypted at rest. We can easily go and put a config rule in that ensures that, and any time that we're to deviate for any reason, say I accidentally provision, I'm doing some manual activity, shame on me, I accidentally provision some infrastructure that's unencrypted, I would immediately get an alert on that. My security and compliance team would also get the alert, and in our weekly security and compliance review meeting, that would come up. I would know that. I'd probably fix it before the issue even came up in the compliance meeting. Once we've got security and finance and compliance and several other business functions in place, how do we really bring all that together?
Right. I think governance is the most important part of the business and technology and operations. How do we govern? How do we remain focused? How do we keep making progress without falling off the cliff? And a term that we like to call ourselves to explain that concept is guardrails. So governance, if you start thinking in terms of how do we have the governance guardrails around us, then it will help us a lot. So going into digging this a little bit deeper, it comes from knowing your business and knowing your business partners. Why do we exist? What do we want to do for our business? What are the right things? What are the opportunities? And what are not so great opportunities for the business? Who are we? What differentiates us? All of that, instead of looking just a pure DevOps problem as a CI/CD or just the security, what serves everyone well if you have a broader view about what business we are in and who we are, how do we operate. For that, many a times the success comes from working backwards, where knowing your customer and then working backwards all the way to your technology and architecture and implementation and operations. So that's a very important number one pattern that I would suggest as working backwards. Now, once you have understanding of those, then how do you continuously improve? How do you treat your operation as a continuous optimization journey, not a destination? I've been into a situation where uh, I, I found myself really celebrating that I had 96% RI utilization, only to realize that a month after it was not so rosy anymore. It was dropped down to like 61%. So how do you continuously not only have visibility, but also have derived actions that are automated in a way that's keeping you on track? If I had a check that would have told me that, hey, your RI utilization is lower than 90%, a check would have already done something instead of waiting and something to happen at 61%. Now, for that to happen, there are again a lot of things that our line of business counterparts can provide us. A good example, and I wish I could go back in time and correct some of the mistakes that I did in my past, is around SLAs, and that's mainly around incident management workflows. And we look at it as an ITIL process. Many look at it as just a way to fix bugs, but it's much bigger and broader than that. If you clearly understand what are the SLAs that businesses have with customers within the functions, within the departments, there may be some legalities around those, but if you have those multi-layer product SLAs helping you derive the architecture and governance framework, then it goes much longer and much better. Another interesting point there is disaster recovery, and this is a discussion that comes up almost every now and then, and when I meet with customers, is people talk about disaster recovery. And I was in the similar journey where I wanted to think about how do I design a disaster recovery, and do I need another data center? Do I need another vendor, provider? All of those. But the reality is, if the disaster recovery kicks in, what's going to happen is, are we looking at 8 hours of recovery time? Are we looking at 1 month of recovery time? Really important thing is to understand what we mean by disaster. A disaster could be that your site went blank for 10 minutes. That could be a big disaster for the business you are in. So really understanding what disaster recovery is, the trend that we are seeing is having active, there is no recovery, but there is active failover, and there is auto recovery in place. And you can really do that if you start to think what your SLAs are, and then work backwards and design your architecture and architecting for operability versus really architecting for technology excellence. And then once you have those, how do you forecast? Remember from our past previous point about finances, how do you forecast what's going to happen, what you're going to need, and constantly changing and evolving your governance framework around those. Now, the govern with present and future in mind is another important part, where you have to still keep the lights on, but you also have to have an understanding of where business is heading and what you're going to need in future. So, and that can come only when you involve your line of business counterparts early enough in your business, in your entire team. And many a times success do come from co-owning the goals with business owners. I've been in places in talking with customers where, oh, our business team, they only keep a tab with the market and they provide us business requirements. But they have no stake in what technology we adopt. They have no stake in how we operate. They don't determine SLAs. I think those are definitely areas where enterprises need to scale up and tighten up a little bit, where all goals are common and it's no more technology team or business team. We together exist for running the business, and we co-own the business goals with the owners having clear stake in that. And then third, deploy the technology that meets the business goals versus here's the shiniest toy. I like to call it shiny toy syndrome. That you can go after, and this is what I want to do. This is what I need for me to perform job well. Only to realize that it's not still aligning well with where business want to do. So uh, the message here is really the pattern here is involve. When we say involve, it's not just having a business person be in your meetings and listening through, but also providing the right value. Can they really co-own the business goals when business goals, not only business goals in terms of revenue and bottom line, but also in terms of SLAs, can they really own it? And once that starts to happen, you see that DevOps starts to mature and your team start to go to the next level of efficiency. And uh, as you start to do that, what happens is you start to think a little bit differently. You start to build SLAs and observability in your architecture. You start to architect with the mind that how would I manage SLA in a much more optimized way. You start to simplify your incident management process. It's no more a big cab meeting sitting with 40 people. You start to think a little bit differently, where you provide constant visibility into the changes that are going in. And you also start to think about a single pane of glass for all visibility in governance and controls. So governance doesn't become someone's audit function where no one knows what they're auditing for, versus everyone knows what we care for, what business needs, and what are the rules of the game, and really providing visibility instead of focusing on who broke the law versus what do we need in our framework, what do we need in our guardrails, so no one really spends time in finding out after the fact. And the this is again towards business continuity. So we do business, and businesses have a reason they exist. They for them to exist, there has to be a plan. There has to be a tighter SLA around. So when we talk about disaster, you really plan for having no disaster and have instant automated recovery. And that's what we're seeing. A lot of redundant activities are getting converted into more innovation when you start thinking about architecting in a way for automated recoveries. Then have meaningful business metrics. Let them be your North Star strategy. Let them define, are you healthy? Not just technology wise, my all HTTP 100 calls are coming up 200, okay. That means only part of business is okay, but overall, what does it look like? And then provide visibility into failures as well. That's very, very important. Unless we provide visibility into failures, your governance framework is not going to be able to iterate over and fix those. That way, they're continuously being improved. Remember, it's all about adaptive learning. How do we learn from governance, compliance, uh, finance, security, all of those into making a larger framework that allows you constantly to move forward and not fall into that great stall that we saw earlier. And that comes only when you can integrate all of these functions right from the get-go, from your designing, from your architecting, and when you're thinking about architecting for operability. With those, we'll go into taking a look at how one of our customer has been able to win and really implement DevOps at a large enterprise scale. So Mike is going to give us more details.
Sure, yeah, and I think one of the reasons I like looking at this case study for the National Australia Bank, as we think about those four patterns we've just reviewed with you, which are really about how you automate the repeatable things and you consult with expertise for the less repeatable things, or drive alignment so that things can be automated and you can go fast. And so in this particular case study with the National Australia Bank, we looked to, or the business goal was to move 30 applications in 50 days. And so in this graph I have here, along the x-axis is time, and vertically is number of applications moved. And you can see a fair amount of them, happened in the second half of the project. And as we relate this back to these patterns of efficiency, is that we spent the time aligning with the different stakeholder groups from compliance, security, governance, finance up front to establish a set of patterns that we could be used. So as it turned out, we selected 18 different migration patterns with built-in quality and controls. And so that can be from alarming to tagging regimes so that these applications could turn up in reports. Now, of course, when we're doing these high-speed migrations, we select, less business critical applications and so on. So what we learned from doing this from an enterprise DevOps perspective was that there needs to be unity. It's a shared problem to solve, and there's shared success. And so that means it's not just a bunch of systems engineers moving applications. No, it's all those different stakeholder groups around the bank that need to partner for this shared successful outcome. Executive support in driving that alignment is critical to help prioritize and move quickly, and then, of course, resolve escalations and blockers. And we learn the way of friendly escalation. How can we bring a security or compliance team in, get the executive business review, either risk is accepted or another means of mitigation is identified, and then that's implemented. Cross-functional delivery becomes essential. So we focus on standardization, not centralization. In governance, that requires a shift from stage gates to those guardrails. Standardizing also means cutting down on red tape and administration. Keep what makes sense to protect the enterprise from that uncertainty and risk, but keep it lean so people can move faster and they can quickly get answers or exceptions to their processes. So AWS can help with this. I suppose it's one of the things I work on every day is enabling enterprise DevOps powered by AWS Managed Services, or AMS. And so we're looking to vend an operating model where we can look after the undifferentiated aspects of infrastructure operations and pre-align with your security, your networking, your access management, your compliance, your governance and finance teams, so that we can agree to a set of controls that we can implement and enforce on your behalf and assist you in advocating for your development teams as they consume those services. And to some extent, we can systematically intermediate interactions between application teams that are then triggering alerts and reporting back to those central IT teams that need that transparency and visibility and can make the right decisions and help us collectively evolve the operating model. All right, Ajit, I think we've made it through most of our content.
At AWS, on DevOps side, we exist so we can enable you to do wonderful things. So you can go and innovate and find those patterns of efficiency so you can run your businesses even better. You can find yourself doing better and better things. For those, we have a great content for you that's coming up. Those who did not attend our last webinar, I have links up on the
Anything happening next week? Do you have any plans next week, Ajit?
Oh yeah, there's something called, there's a big ocean of activities coming up there, reInvent. So we have a couple sessions coming up for you there. There's Enterprise DevOps, begin with production ready, and then we have another session of patterns of efficiency where we'll dig in and see other patterns of efficiencies. And those of you who are coming to reInvent, stop by, say hi to us, and attend those sessions. I think we have a great content